Thank you very much. And what a wonderfully diverse and also global perspective so far. Mine's going to focus a bit more on justice. I think we've talked a lot about things like equity and some of the economic and political factors of transitions, but I do think that justice brings to light a different perspective and also perhaps one that's a bit more complicated. And so I think one of the core lessons that I want to kind of underscore today for everyone is that even when you seek to promote justice and you try to do justice aware energy planning or climate policy, even then you still create losers, as in even justice interventions create injustice. And as a few examples for you from our research, many of you have heard already these kind of stats about global energy deprivation. South Asia, the continent, has almost as high rates of energy poverty as sub-Saharan Africa. And because of that, countries like India have embarked upon widespread electrification efforts, often powered by fossil fuels because those are low cost. And these fossil fuel electrification efforts save lives because they help displace, biomass-based cooking or more polluting sources of energy that are less efficient. But that electrification also then relies on coal mining, and to keep coal prices low, it even includes underage coal mining. So here's a great example of an intervention designed to provide energy for children, also hurts other children at other parts of the supply chain. Or if you want an example closer to home, we are still here in Europe suffering the impacts of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. This shows you some of the thyroid cancer victims in Belarus. This photograph was not taken in 1986. It was not taken in 1990. It was not taken in 2000. It was taken in 2015. So just a few years ago. And that boy on the right is only 11 years old. So it really underscores how the impacts of that accident are still hurting communities in the Ukraine and Belarus and parts of Russia. And yet, those nuclear power plants provided modernization and industrialization for millions of people, lifting them out of poverty, providing energy for factories, and also even enabling things like democracy to flourish in the Ukraine. So again, it's a really risky trade-off. We achieved widespread energy security at the risk of accidents and marginalizing some communities living close to power plants. Halfway around the world in sub-Saharan Africa, the very battery electric vehicle transition in Norway relies upon materials and minerals like lithium and copper and cobalt that are currently extracted in very dangerous ways. This shows an artisanal miner near Lubumbashi, which is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo near Zambia. And again, these miners have very short lifespans. They're exposed to silicosis, mercury, mine collapse, even diseases that are spread in the mines because there are rats and other things. But these minerals are needed for our heat pumps, our solar panels, and our other low carbon forms of electricity and mobility. So again, one winner and one loser. And the final example just goes to show you what happens when you electrify transport in Europe. Where do you all think that the dirty conventional petrol cars go? They don't just disappear, right? They end up going to peripheral markets with less stringent standards like Ghana or Eastern Europe or the Asia Pacific. And so this is a way of how decarbonization doesn't eliminate dirty technologies. It just displaces them, moves them around. So they no longer are in places like the United States or the Nordic region. So I think this really underscores this pesky notion of justice and how hard it is to create pro-poor, just interventions. And one of the things that we've done within my group, it's kind of messy and complicated, is we've tried to promote a whole systems approach to justice. And what we're kind of doing here is arguing justice issues don't only occur where these technologies are used. It's not just the household that's using the solar panel or the municipality in Norway that's electrifying their transport fleet or the wind farm that may be getting constructed offshore in the United Kingdom. The justice issues transcend across different scales of the technology. So there's a spatial element to it. Some of these impacts are very local, near communities. Some are very national, reverberating across national policy regimes and, affecting subsidies. And some are even global. And moreover, some occur at the manufacturing and assembly of the technologies. Some occur during their use, and some occur actually very later, at the end of life. I was amazed to read last year that the current waste streams embodied in solar panels will equal the world's waste streams of electronic waste, as in the volume of e-waste from solar energy will be greater than the world's total amount of e-waste by the year 2040. So we have an impending crisis. With the more low carbon technology we use, the more waste streams we create, and have to think about recycling, reuse, power ups, and things like cradle to cradle design. Underscoring the global dimension of these impacts, we did this study here that actually looked at 4 transitions. They're in yellow there. The 4 transitions were EVs, electric vehicles in Norway, smart meters in Great Britain, nuclear power in France, and solar energy in Germany. And based on our data, we were asking participants, experts, communities, et cetera, tell us about negative impacts or injustices that occur outside of the country. And it's amazing. Every country in red here was identified as having some sort of impact or disbenefit or injustice, even though the 4 transitions we looked at were very European. So this underscores the multi-scalar nation of injustices and how they circulate and cascade around the world. From low carbon transitions interfering with Canadian tar sands production, to depending on lithium mines that pollute water in Colombia and Bolivia, to mining practices in sub-Saharan Africa, to LNG markets in Australia, to low-wage manufacturing and labor practices in China, to even things like the interruption of profits for Gazprom, which is trying to sell cheap gas into Europe. And what's quite problematic is when you do take one of these whole systems approaches, the kind of the catalog or inventory of vulnerable groups grows. It doesn't shrink. Here in this very recent study published this year, we reviewed 20 years of literature with 332 case studies of some sort of injustice related to a climate pathway. Climate pathway here was meant to be climate mitigation. So anything from land use change to agriculture to light bulbs and EVs and heat pumps to renewables. And you can see here on the right the huge list of who's hurt. Non-human species are at the top, local hosting communities are second, but look at the list as well. Farmers, the rural poor, banks, women, the urban poor, people with disabilities, even connections to prostitution and criminal syndicates like the mafia, which are involved in things like wind turbines in Italy, trying to get construction permits and consolidate intellectual property. And so it really opens our eyes to the complexity of vulnerability. And I think it would be remiss of me not to also give special attention to indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities, because it seems like our low carbon transitions often marginalize them the most. And as you can see here, this is also from that same review, many of these groups are under threat from multiple interventions. Right? It's not just one like solar or wind. Look at the indigenous communities in Bolivia under threat from electric vehicles, smart grids, renewable energy, or people in the Amazon under threat from biofuel plantations or biochar use, which is associated with negative emissions technologies like BECCS, bioenergy, with carbon capture and storage. And what's really tragic about this table, coming from the literature, this is one page of it. This is another page of it. This is another page of it. And if you go back to the table, you'll also see some of the very communities that in the Nordic region displaced by things like wind energy or tree plantations, Sami populations who are under threat to these types of interventions that are hurting their lifestyles. So a final thing before I go, I wanted to talk about how not only do these types of things cascade into indigenous groups, they also have impacts for countries in the global north and for those of us that are trying to adopt the technologies. And this from a special issue of low carbon innovations for mobility just shows you how access to the innovation is not equal. The characteristics of who the adopters are strongly distorted or mediated or shaped by demographics. And so the typical adopter of an EV isn't your ordinary person. It's usually a wealthy, white, upper class male, highly educated. Right. And you see similar trends for things like bike sharing and car sharing and automated vehicles. And you also see very different motivations that drive them, some of which are negative, that erode sustainability. So the question of whether these innovations actually promote sustainability and climate goals is also contextual. It's not predetermined. It depends on how these technologies are actually used in practice. And I think that's why, coming back to the heading of the talk and the conference, we need to rethink how energy is discussed. We can definitely talk about it in terms of costs and benefits and in terms of externalities and politics, but we also need to talk about it in terms of ethics and morality. And that is precisely why we have promoted this energy justice lens that talks about how you have to holistically grapple with hazards and externalities, fairness and disparities, and patterns of ownership and access, governance and procedures about policymaking, free prior informed consent, due process, and even things like how you handle disputes and vulnerable groups, and giving those in our society who've already been marginalized special consideration rather than equal consideration, so that we can truly show that the next 50 years, the low carbon transitions we're after become more equitable and don't just perpetuate the inequalities of the existing regime. And with that, I'm very happy to turn it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Benjamin. That was mind-blowing, and you clearly demonstrate the massive challenges that we're facing. Everything's interconnected. And I was thinking during your presentation that in many ways in many cases, you're actually describing the different dilemmas. And now we're at the situation where we want to draw more people into the energy system. We need to give more people access to energy. And there are a couple of questions from the audience here that I would like to ask you. The first one is directly to you, Benjamin. Have you tried to quantify these effects? The fact that disadvantages have been reported is interesting, but we cannot make judgments without first knowing how serious the issues are. What do you say?
No, it's a great question, and the short answer is no. Our research hasn't tried to quantify them. It's partly our design was very qualitative. It's also partly where I'm from. Our group is a bit more skeptical of quantification. We're a bit more critical of it. And I do think that some of the things that we're capturing, like the death of children or the loss of species, are dangerous to quantify. You start quantifying them, they kind of become more acceptable. But I do think our qualitative data lends itself to quantification if those want to do it. You just have to work out how you create hierarchies and how you weight different things. Because I would argue that some of the injustices that we talk about, like death and human rights abuses and species loss, are far more serious than some of the other ones, like traffic congestion or people feeling anxious about having a smart meter installed. Those are all within our catalog of injustices. And so I do think that quantification could help us grapple with more severe ones, but I think that's not work that we've done yet.
No.